This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome all the witnesses. Thank you for your time and your testimony. I'm going to keep my opening statement incredibly brief because I'm going to want to spend more of my time asking questions once we hear from the witnesses. I have an opening statement which I'll ask to be entered in the record. My questions will all be about eliciting the reality of the current situation and what is going to be happening in the next couple of months and why this is so important that we address this issue. So that's what I'm hoping we're going to hear in testimony, and that'll be the thrust of my questions. But with that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member for his. Reserve my opening statement so I can spend a little more time asking questions. I do want everybody to refer to this basic balance sheet with a number of columns. And what I've tried to do is, because it's a financial problem, and we've got to look at numbers. And so I just want to quick lay out for my colleagues and for the witnesses how this thing is set up. The first column is the current balance sheet, the way it's reported by the government, which is not GAAP accounting. The second column puts on balance sheet the fund balances as well as the unfunded liability of the retirement system and the healthcare system. Then the columns A, B, and C, the first scenario A simply re-amortizes the short-term liability back into where it really should be classified. It basically reclassifies the long-term liability to where it should be. Then you start talking about Medicare integration as well as current debt restructuring. Now, I realize this is relatively complicated, but if you really take a look at this, I think it really lays out and crystallizes the main problem here, and that's the point, I think, of this hearing is let's try and make this as simple as possible. And I think, Mr. Milstein, I think you did a really good job of laying out the four main problem areas. Let's go to number 2, where you talked about rigid regulation of pricing. I know in the last go-around here, we compared U.S. Postal System price increases versus their competitors, UPS and FedEx. Off the top of my head, I think over a 6-year period, this was a couple of years ago, UPS and FedEx had increased their prices about 33%. The Postal System was somewhere between 14 and 16%, depending on which service you're looking at. Do you have any information on kind of the current status of that, of how far the Postal System is behind competitively of raising prices?
I don't, sir. But in the materials we provided, there's one interesting stat. The Postal Service carries in the package business about the same volume as FedEx, and yet earns half the revenue of FedEx. So the dominant market package deliverer is UPS. So the Postal Service is a real competitor and a growing competitor in that package space, and it is the future, I think, of the business. But it is hamstrung in competing in that package space by the price regulations under which they operate. In part, they're not limited in the package space in the same way they're limited in the first-class mail and standard mail space. But the key here is the Postal Service must maintain a network that reaches all 155 delivery points, whereas the UPS and FedEx can pick their spots, dense urban markets where the cost per unit of delivery is much lower than servicing all 155. So what we face is giving the service the pricing flexibility to be able to price all of its products so as to be able to maintain that network.
Okay, again, I want to go, when the exogenous price increase is no more, and basically they've recovered the amount of money they were supposed to recover. It's not a timing, it's how much pricing they've done. I do want to talk about what that would actually do to postal rates when you combine I would say the misclassification of the long-term liability as was forced to be reclassified as a short-term liability. The combination of those two things go to Postmaster General. Can you talk about what effect that would have on pricing?
Let me say, Mr. Chairman, first, if I may, the comment about competitive pricing. We do consistently evaluate where we have headroom to take price on the competitive side. We did recently just raise our prices roughly 10%, first time in 3 years. Now, on the market dominant side, the challenge is those products generate roughly 76% of our revenue, and they're capped. So that is why the urgency of addressing the exigent surcharge and the rollback in April is critical to us, because it will impact us $1 billion negative hit on our top line revenue this fiscal year and $2.1 billion going forward.
And that will require legislation to prevent that rollback, correct?
Sir, yes. The PRC order requires that once we achieve or collect the $4.6 billion, we need to roll prices back.
I've always, as an accountant, I've always been a little bothered by the talk of pre-funding the health care plan, because we really didn't pre-fund it. We just really reclassified a long-term liability to a short-term liability, correct? I mean, it's really just been a balance sheet entry, correct?
Yes.
There really wasn't any funding going on. We just borrowed more money. It was short-term borrowing, and we've just, I think, improperly reclassified a long-term liability into a current liability. Is that basically true?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of what we must do, I mean, from my standpoint, just according to GAAP, we should accurately reflect this is a long-term liability versus short-term liability. But you've got a 4-point plan. Having done this a couple of years ago and having the scars on my back for trying to actually come to a compromise solution here, what are the areas of agreement between all the interested parties, and there are a lot of them? What are the areas of agreement? I know Senator Carper wanted a touchdown. Maybe we ought to be thinking about a field goal.
Yeah.
What are the things that we absolutely must do to avoid a real calamity in terms of the postal system and pricing, and what is going to be possible to do here in the short term?
Yeah. Sir, in terms of pricing, it would be maintain the exigent, make that part of the rate base. That will generate $2.1 billion annually. In terms of the large...
Is there any resistance to that?
Yes. Now, I will say that there are many in the industry, a broad cross-section that supports that. Because part of the proposal that we put forth would be bake the exigent into the rate base and then forego any CPI price increase in calendar year 16 or 17. And then in 2017, we have the price review that the PRC will undertake. And that's critically important.
Okay, so we have to get in business. You try not to roll back prices, okay?
Right.
Particularly when you're already at lower prices than your competition anyway. So to me, that would be somewhat of a no-brainer. But okay, so that's the first thing. Where else? So we don't have total agreement on that. But I think if you really have a level head, you want to see a vibrant, viable postal system, you have to agree to that. What's the next area of agreement?
Yeah. Sir, cornerstone, and I have heard no one dispute the fact that we should ensure that we are fully integrated with Medicare for retirees 65 and older. As mentioned, the Postal Service has paid $29 billion into that fund, and our employees should benefit from it. We're asking to be treated like any self-funded entity.
But according to so what the game plan there would be, though, would be to offload the roughly $100 billion liability of the health benefit plan, right, the pension health benefit plan, onto Medicare. But we're not transferring the assets in that health benefit plan? So you're going to offload about $100 billion liability into Medicare, but the postal system is going to maintain the $50 billion of assets in their fund?
Well, and I think as discussed, accounting principles would indicate that that should shift as well.
But right now, according to the proposal, as it's laid out for me, that's not being contemplated when we integrate it.
I think
so
that's...
the postal system holds on to the $50 billion, offloads $100 billion liability onto Medicare, the American taxpayer. I would agree, probably get some credit for the $29 billion, and we talked earlier in the cloakroom. We don't know of that $29 billion funding out of payroll deductions how much postal system has actually used.
Yes, we don't have access to that information.
They have used some of it, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Ms. Rectanis, you talked about a $100 billion unfunded liability. According to the balance sheet here, it's about $79 billion. Can you describe, looking at the summary figures here, can you tell me where the difference is?
You mean the $100 billion for retiree health benefits?
Okay, you're only talking about that.
Well,
But that's not unfunded because they have $50 billion of offsetting assets in their fund.
yes, according to the CBO data that we use, the unfunded obligation was 101 obligation left. That was based on the $50 billion that they do have in the assets.
So the unfunded liability, so the total liability is $150 billion, offset by $50 billion in the asset fund. Mr. Milstein, can you address that?
I don't think that's right. I think the CBO liability is 105 billion and the asset offset is 50-ish.
Okay. Well, sure, go ahead. Let me just say, this is and again, I'm not beating up any witness here. This is the problem I've been having for a number of years. You know, again, as an accountant, I understand numbers, and I can't get them. You know, there's just so much confusion in this issue, and yet we passed a 2006 law that reclassified a long-term liability into a short-term liability that creates a real pinch on the Postal Service that never should have occurred. So if we're going to pass something, we need the information, and we need it accurate. And so we've got a long way to go. I guess I'll stop at this point in time. I guess I've kind of made my point. I am still not there in terms of understanding the financial condition of the postal system, exactly what these proposals would do, as well as who's for them and who's against them. The way you get results, and we've actually proven in this committee, by looking for areas of agreement that unifies as opposed to exploiting differences, you can actually get results. We've actually passed 55 pieces of legislation through this committee. 16 have already been signed into law. We've got to find that sweet spot here, because everybody I talk to says we have to keep the postal system viable, and I agree with that, and yet we haven't had all those parties come together and find an agreement. So the first thing you have to agree on, though, is we got to get the numbers right, and we got to know what we're actually doing, and we're not there yet. Mr. Williams, you can quick comment before I turn it over to Senator Carper.
Thanks, Senator. I think the liability, as you said, is $79 billion. That's the mandate. We have additional liabilities, though. Workman's compensation brings it up to about $98 billion, and when you add the Treasury debt, it's $125 billion. Those are all of our liabilities. The mandate is to prepay $79 billion.
Okay, so again, I've been at this quite some time, trying to get, so what we need to do is working with you, let's come up with a relatively simplified balance sheet that lays it out so there aren't any questions about this. You know, so we're not dealing with a bunch of different numbers, oh, well, that's not included here, or this is off balance sheet there. I think this is a pretty good format that I'm really just going to ask people, just for my benefit and nobody else's, give me the information. Okay, work on this, and we'll talk to you afterwards. Senator, to you. Again, I want to thank the witnesses. This is an issue, as Senator Booker elicited. We have to address this. And literally, failure is not an option. So I wanted to hold this hearing, and Madam Postmaster General, I will definitely be sitting down with you.
Thank you.
And I think you understand my passion to get the actual facts and figures straight.
Yes, sir.
So I know exactly what we're dealing with when we head to some kind of markup with the areas of agreement to get a result. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So again, that's my commitment. We'll definitely hop into this with